Have you ever watched a bird in a cage that's never learned to fly? It sits there, wings intact, perfectly capable of soaring, yet it remains motionless on its perch. Not because it can't fly, but because it's never been allowed to discover that it could. This is the hidden reality of millions of adults who grew up with controlling parents. They carry invisible chains, invisible limitations that were forged not through cruelty, but through a kind of suffocating love that never let them breathe on their own. Today, we're diving deep into the psychology of what happens when childhood becomes a carefully orchestrated performance, rather than a journey of discovery. Because here's what most people don't understand about controlling parenting. It doesn't create stronger children, it creates adults who are terrified of their own power. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like. Imagine a household where every decision flows through one person, where a child learns that their natural impulses, their curiosity, their desire to explore and make mistakes are somehow dangerous, where love becomes conditional on compliance, and independence is treated like rebellion. This isn't about physical abuse or obvious neglect. This is about something far more subtle, and in many ways more damaging. The systematic dismantling of a child's sense of agency. The psychology behind this is fascinating and heartbreaking. When parents become overly controlling, they're usually operating from their own wounds, their own fears, their own unmet needs. Maybe they married someone they resent, and now they're determined to shape their child into everything their spouse isn't. Maybe they feel powerless in their own lives, so they grasp for control wherever they can find it. Maybe they're genuinely trying to protect their child from the mistakes they made, not realizing they're preventing their child from developing the very skills needed to navigate life. But here's where it gets psychologically complex. Control rarely happens in a vacuum. It takes two people to create this dynamic. The parent who needs to control, and the child who learns to be controlled. And this is where the real tragedy begins. Because once a child adapts to being controlled, they start losing something essential. Their internal drive begins to atrophy. Think about it this way. If someone else is always making your decisions, always pushing you forward, always telling you what to do and when to do it, why would you develop your own motivation? Why would you learn to trust your instincts? Why would you build confidence in your ability to navigate challenges? You wouldn't. Instead, you'd become dependent on that external push, that constant guidance, that persistent management of your life. This creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, but in a much more sophisticated form. The child doesn't just learn they can't control their environment, they learn they shouldn't even try. They learn that their natural impulses are wrong, their desires are selfish, their independence is threatening. So they shut down those parts of themselves and become what the controlling parent needs them to be. Compliant, predictable, safe. Years pass, and this dynamic becomes so normalized that neither party realizes what's happening. The parent believes they're being helpful, protective, loving. The child believes this is just how families work. But underneath, something profound is being lost. The child's sense of self, their ability to make decisions, their confidence in their own judgment, their capacity for healthy relationships. Because here's what controlling parents often don't realize. When you don't let a child practice making decisions, they never learn how to make good ones. When you don't let them experience natural consequences, they never develop resilience. When you solve all their problems for them, they never build problem-solving skills. When you manage all their relationships, they never learn how to navigate social dynamics on their own. The result is an adult who looks capable on the outside but feels lost on the inside. Someone who achieved all the external markers of success, education, career, accomplishments, but who feels empty and directionless. Someone who still seeks permission from others before making major life decisions. Someone who struggles with relationships because they never learned how to be vulnerable, how to set boundaries, how to communicate their needs. And the cruelest irony? These adults often blame themselves. They think there's something fundamentally wrong with them. They don't realize that their struggles aren't character flaws. They're the natural result of being raised in an environment where their autonomy was systematically undermined. The controlling parent creates what I call the permission-seeking adult. This is someone who has learned that their own judgment can't be trusted, that their desires are somehow wrong, that they need external validation for every choice they make. They become experts at reading other people's expectations and molding themselves to fit those expectations. But they become strangers to their own inner voice. In relationships, this shows up in devastating ways. They might attract partners who are also controlling because that dynamic feels familiar, or they might struggle with intimacy because they never learned how to be authentic, how to show up as themselves rather than as a carefully crafted version designed to please others. They might find themselves constantly seeking approval, constantly worried about disappointing people, constantly sacrificing their own needs to avoid conflict. The workplace becomes another arena where these patterns play out. They might excel at following directions but struggle with leadership. They might be incredibly reliable but lack creative initiative. They might avoid taking risks or speaking up because they've been conditioned to believe that their independent thoughts and actions are somehow dangerous or wrong. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect is how it affects their relationship with themselves. Because when you've spent your entire childhood learning that your natural instincts are wrong, that your desires don't matter, that your voice shouldn't be heard, you develop a profound mistrust of your own inner world. You become disconnected from your emotions, your passions, your dreams. You learn to live from the outside in rather than the inside out. This disconnection from self creates a unique kind of loneliness. Even when surrounded by people, even when achieving external success, there's a persistent feeling of emptiness, of not being truly known or understood. Because how can others know you when you don't know yourself? How can others love you when you've never learned to love the parts of yourself that were deemed unacceptable? The psychology of control is insidious because it masquerades as love. The controlling parent genuinely believes they're helping, protecting, guiding their child toward a better life. But what they're actually doing is creating an adult who will struggle to access their own power, their own wisdom, their own capacity for joy and fulfillment. Understanding this dynamic is the first step toward healing, toward reclaiming the parts of yourself that were suppressed, toward learning to trust your own judgment and honor your own needs. Because that caged bird we talked about at the beginning, its wings are still there. It can still learn to fly. But here's where the story gets even more complex, and this is something most people never realize. The child who grows up under this kind of control doesn't just become passive. They become incredibly skilled at reading emotional temperatures, at sensing danger, at managing other people's feelings. They develop what I call hypervigilant empathy. They can walk into a room and immediately sense who's upset, who needs managing, who might explode if they're not carefully handled. This isn't a superpower. It's a survival mechanism. Because in a household where one person's emotions dictate everyone else's reality, you learn to become an emotional meteorologist. You study the warning signs, you track the pressure changes, you prepare for the storms, and most importantly, you learn that your job is to prevent those storms from happening, even if it means shrinking yourself, even if it means sacrificing your own needs, even if it means living in a constant state of hypervigilance. The psychological toll of this is staggering. Imagine spending your entire childhood as an unpaid therapist to your own parent. Imagine learning that love means managing someone else's emotions rather than being seen and accepted for who you are. Imagine growing up believing that your worth is measured by how well you can keep the peace, how effectively you can make others comfortable, how successfully you can disappear when your presence becomes inconvenient. This creates what researchers call emotional parentification. The child becomes responsible for the parent's emotional well-being rather than the other way around. And this reversal of roles creates profound confusion about boundaries, about responsibility, about what healthy relationships actually look like. Because if you learn that love means sacrificing yourself to manage someone else's feelings, how do you ever learn to ask for what you need? How do you learn that your emotions matter too? Years later, these adults find themselves in relationships where they're constantly walking on eggshells. They've become so skilled at reading micro-expressions, at sensing the slightest shift in mood, that they can't relax. They can't just be present. They're always scanning, always monitoring, always preparing to manage the next emotional crisis, and the exhaustion is overwhelming. But there's another layer to this that's even more insidious. The controlling parent doesn't just control actions, they control narrative. They become the author of their child's story, the interpreter of their child's experiences, the voice that explains what everything means. The child learns not to trust their own perception of reality, because there's always someone else ready to tell them what they really experienced, what they really felt, what really happened. This is psychological gaslighting on a systemic level. The child's internal compass gets so scrambled that they lose the ability to distinguish between their own thoughts and the thoughts that have been planted there by others. They learn to second-guess every instinct, to doubt every feeling, to question every desire, because somewhere along the way they internalize the message that their inner world isn't reliable, isn't valid, isn't worth trusting. The result is an adult who lives perpetually outside themselves. They've become experts at performing the version of themselves that others want to see, but they've lost touch with who they actually are underneath all those layers of adaptation. They might excel at their careers, maintain friendships, even have romantic relationships, but there's always this nagging sense of being an imposter, of not belonging in their own life. And here's what makes this particularly cruel. Society often rewards these adults for the very traits that were born from their childhood wounds. They're praised for being selfless, for being accommodating, for being low maintenance. They're valued for their ability to anticipate needs, to smooth over conflicts, to make everyone else comfortable. But what looks like emotional intelligence from the outside is often just sophisticated survival programming from the inside. The tragedy is that these adults have usually become incredibly good at taking care of everyone except themselves. They can sense when their friend needs support, when their partner is stressed, when their coworker is struggling. But ask them what they need, what they want, what would make them happy, and they freeze. Because somewhere along the way they learn that their needs don't matter, that their desires are selfish, that their happiness is less important than everyone else's comfort. So here we are, at the end of this exploration, and maybe you recognize yourself in these patterns. Maybe you see your own story reflected in these words, your own struggles mapped out in psychological terms that finally make sense. And if you do, I want you to know something crucial. This recognition isn't the end, it's the beginning. Because understanding the psychology of control is the first step toward breaking free from it. When you can see the invisible chains, you can start to unlock them. When you understand that your struggles aren't personal failures but predictable responses to an impossible situation, you can begin to have compassion for yourself instead of judgment. That bird in the cage, the one we talked about at the beginning, it doesn't have to stay there forever. Yes, learning to fly after a lifetime of captivity is terrifying. Yes, trusting your own wings when you've been told they're broken is the hardest thing you'll ever do. But those wings are still there. Your capacity for joy, for authentic connection, for living from your own center rather than everyone else's expectations, it's all still there, waiting to be reclaimed. The journey isn't easy, and it isn't quick. But every small act of self-trust, every boundary you set, every time you choose your own voice over the voices that have been controlling your story, you're teaching yourself how to fly. And maybe, just maybe, you'll discover that you were never broken at all. You were just waiting for permission to be whole. Drop a comment and share your story, and if this resonated with you, hit like and subscribe because we dive deep into psychology that actually explains how your mind works. See you next time.